Oftentimes when people think about growing food for their own survival, nightmarishly apocalyptic thoughts can set in, or even just thinking about all the food you might have to produce for you and your loved ones might be kind of overwhelming. So in this video, I want to break down survival gardening, or gardening to meet your own needs, with 6 simple points to consider. And you'll find that in some ways it doesn't really matter whether you live in an apartment complex or if you live way out in the backcountry. You can still make huge strides towards meeting your needs and meeting the needs of your family. So when it comes to survival gardening, we want to simplify things as much as possible. If we can set up a strong and simple foundation on the landscape, so to speak, ideally then we can let nature take care of all of the other complexity. So before I even get into any of this, right, one thing that you really want to consider is yourself, right? Your own body, your family, your closest friends, some neighbors, etc., etc. And so you really want to get to know yourself well, and you want to get to know these other people well. What are your own food preferences? You can grow some really healthy and or calorie dense foods, but if they don't agree with you, or if you don't like the taste of them, what's the point? So you really kind of have to customize a lot of this to your own likeness and those of any other people concerned, but also consider the context of the landscape. What type of growing environment do you have? What plants are going to be compatible where? Those types of things. So anyway, going off of that idea of context, what options do you have for your growing environment, right? What type of space do you have available, and how much of it? Is it indoor or outdoor? Do you live in an apartment complex or inner city, or do you live out in the country, or somewhere in between? So definitely get to know how much space is available. And we're not just talking about land outside or the backyard, but also windowsills, countertops, community gardens, things like that. Windowsills can be immensely helpful for growing plants, especially starting plants indoors early, or even if you just want to grow a few herbs, or growing sprouts too. Can work very well when grown on a windowsill or countertop, or a table you have set up next to the window. We can also talk about like supplemental lighting, like LED grow lights that use a fairly low amount of electricity to give plants, hopefully, at least a bare minimum of some of the light requirements that they have. I have produced some indoor tomatoes in the middle of the winter when grown under grow lights, and I pollinated the flowers with a paintbrush. But if the grid goes down, maybe you don't have those grow lights, or maybe you do if you have some savings of alternative energy, whether it be a generator, solar panels, batteries, whatever. Also, what about outdoor space, right? We mentioned the community gardens, or you can grow plants in other places too. Even some places where you might not necessarily think. Maybe you can stick a few edible crops in between, some ornamental plantings in a front yard, if you just have a little bit of space there. Or think about three-dimensional and growing plants in pots on the back porch. Or maybe you do have more space in the backyard. Maybe you have a quarter of an acre. Maybe you have multiple acres. How are you going to use that space most effectively? What angle is the sun at a particular time of day? Where and when is shade cast on that landscape? What is the soil like? What types of weather events do you generally get? Hurricanes, tornadoes, thunderstorms. So anyway, with the space available, we can kind of learn to be more creative and think outside the box, right? Taking advantage of these windowsills, growing sprouts or other really super nutritious crops in a limited amount of space. Secondly is, what are our choice energy crops, right? What are going to be the nutrient dense or energy dense foods that are going to really keep us going? What types of foods do we like to eat that also fill us up and leave us feeling good afterwards? And do those crops grow well in your area? What are different ways you can prepare and eat them? And how can you store them for over time? So some of my choice energy crops would be, parsnips. They have a really sweet root that can be cooked into a whole bunch of different dishes and adds sustenance to a lot of different foods. and I like the taste of it. Beans are very versatile. They've been a staple crop of many civilizations in the past, and they can be a really good source of protein. And they can also be relatively easy to grow, and they don't require a lot of nitrogen, right? So they can grow in poorer soils. Sunchokes are a native plant to North America, and they're native to this area where I am, so they grow pretty well, right? Although I do have to be careful of deer and make sure that they are protected from these animals, otherwise they may not survive. Secondly, we want to talk about closing loops, so to speak, right? Another term I could have put up here is being more self-sufficient, more self-reliant, maybe not being so reliant upon other seed companies when you order seeds. So get in the practice of growing your own seeds and saving them and storing them and then replanting them. There's a lot that can be learned in between the time of harvesting the seeds and planting them the next season. Also, natural pest control. Instead of buying synthetic or even organic OMRI approved whatever chemicals and pesticides that may be used to keep pests off, whether it's an insect or fungi, whatever, what measures does nature have in place that may help to remedy some of these issues and assert a sense of natural balance on that landscape, right? That way it's less work you have to do, it's more efficient, and you don't have to be dependent on buying things. Also, the food that is produced, how do you prepare it? How do you preserve it? And what type of shelf life does it have? And so in general, the more homemade we can do things, whether it's collecting the seeds or the types of containers that we collect the seeds in and how we store them to protect them from various insects during the wintertime or from dampness, may eventually or ultimately have to come from solutions that your local landscape provides. And this is where naturally adapted plants to your area can really come in, and they can really shine. Usually a lot of native plants to my area require stratification of their seeds, right? So this is a natural mechanism that gives these seeds the ability to overwinter and sprout in the spring and not any earlier. Or even in the case of sunchokes, which can propagate through tubers, they survive the wintertime in that state, and then they sprout up in the spring. So native plants can offer immense benefits in that regard. Also homemade compost and potting mixes and learning how to work with those can also make you a lot more self-reliant, where again you just don't have to purchase those plastic bags of whatever. Fourth on the list is camouflage. This is kind of an interesting topic. Ultimately, we really want to work together with as many individuals and people and animals in a way in order to really have an efficient, effective, and meaningful system. But there may be times or there may be instances or certain contexts where our food that's produced may need to not be obvious. So basically, if someone were to look at a landscape and they see a bunch of useless weeds or whatever, versus when they see a very manicured garden of a lot of crops that they recognized, they're probably going to be a lot more apt to go for that garden that looks very familiar to them, right? Because it has tomatoes and zucchini that you can also see in the grocery store or on a restaurant plate or whatever. So what types of crops, what varieties of crops are you growing? How many other people might recognize that? Where are you growing them on the landscape? And that's kind of another example of where you can kind of let nature take care of some of that camouflage in a way. There may also be, in certain types of contexts, different opportunities for certain types of fencing that can be found on the landscape that may work to help kind of blend in the garden a little further. And then also, right, we want to not forget to protect our garden crops from animals, right? Certain crops are going to be a lot more attractive to animals than others. Know which ones those are. Deer can eat many different crops, like the sunchokes I mentioned. So that's why it's important to diversify our crops. And if we can identify the certain crops that are going to be most attractive to these animals, we can grow those in a specific area with maybe more protection, more fencing, more caging, etc., etc. But then also in some ways, do we also want to make sure that these animals have a sustainable space on that landscape as well? And it might benefit us, or at least some of us, to make sure that we have a plentiful supply of animals that are healthy and well fed on that landscape as well. Fifthly, we can talk about water. And really, this is probably way more important when you're talking about water to sustain your thirst, because we can only live 3 to 4 days without water, and on that last day or so, you're essentially barely alive, borderline comatose, right? But in the context of gardening, we want to consider water, right? How can we collect it? Maybe if there's a cistern or some type of pool or pond, or even if we have rain barrels that are connected to a gutter system, either of a house or a garage or a shed or whatever the case may be. So we want to be able to collect excess water so that we can use that in times of need, maybe in times of drought, or if there's some fire that breaks out, or whatever. It's always good to have a good supply of water on hand. Of course, it's important to check with laws and regulations in your areas. Some places don't like the harvesting of rainwater for domestic use, but yet they have no problem subsidizing unsustainable farming practices that continue to drain aquifers. And if we do want to talk about cisterns, well, how do we make them? Or rain barrels? Well, what if we don't have plastic or metal, And then also water in the garden, right? The water that's already coming down in the rain and is held in the ground, how can we maximize that to last as long as possible and be as effective as possible? And so essentially it comes down to two things, right? We want to increase the amount of organic matter in the soil, especially the decomposed organic matter, because this is going to contain the acids, the glycoproteins, and all those other things that are going to really enhance the soil's ability to capture and hold water on that landscape. And it's also going to be able to harbor a whole bunch of beneficial microbe life for the growing plants. And then the second thing is covering the soil, whether it be a mulch of grass clippings or leaves or other detritus, or just plant cover, right? Maybe we have a living ground cover or a living mulch, or we're just maximizing that garden space so that we have a lot of leaf coverage over that ground. And that is going to help minimize water loss directly from the soil, and it'll also buffer any heat intensity or anything like that. And so the more mulch and plant cover we have, the less water that is lost directly from the soil. Sixth is very important. Community, right? Of course, we want to talk about the ecological community of the different types of beneficial insects, beneficial birds and animals, fungi, the bacteria, etc., etc., because that is ultimately going to really help determine if a garden is going to thrive or not. It can make a gardening experience more easy or more difficult. And commonly, we don't necessarily have to overthink that thriving of the ecological community, right? Nature really takes care of that. We just have to plant a variety of crops, maybe sprinkle in some flowers, have some native plants for beneficial pollinators, have some nearby native trees for, native birds, and it doesn't really take much to get the ball rolling. Even some of the weeds out there are native and can have beneficial effects as well. You don't even have to plant them, like American burnweed or horseweed are both native to North America. But then we also want to consider the human community, and this can be maybe a nerve-wracking idea or concept for a lot of people, especially in a survival situation. How many of us really know our neighbors, or are we on good terms with them? Or maybe we're not. Or even within our own families, how well do we work together and get along? And these can be some pretty tough questions, but they're very important, because if it's just you taking care of your own needs, most of the time it's not going to be very easy. And sometimes what you can accomplish alone just won't be enough. And even if you can, and it's just you, for most of us, that's not an environment that encourages psychological stability and well-being over the long term, right? And so it's really important to be on the best terms that we can with them, share things, and have different local things where, you know, you do something for someone and they do something back for you, and getting to know each other, knowing who you can trust, you know, sharing knowledge and information, educating each other are all really important aspects, because ultimately, and as removed as we feel we may be these days, we are part of that ecological community. And it's not just you, but it's, you know, it's all of us. It's the people around you as well. And if we can keep that dynamic balance of harmony working on all of these different levels, that is really going to give you the best chance for survival. So we have these 6 simple points, and we can make them, as evidenced by this video, as complicated and extensive as we want. So beyond that, what have I missed? What are maybe a point or some points that you want to offer down in the comments that we should keep in mind for having a survival garden? What might be your crops of choice or gardening techniques? Alright, thank you so much for checking out this video on survival gardening. Hope you learned a few things. There's a lot that can be intimidating or overwhelming when we talk about subjects like this. But if we take a deep breath and we focus on one thing at a time, keeping in mind these 6 points of the available space we have, our crops that we have for our choice energy sources, closing the loops, camouflage, water, and community, we should be in a pretty good space moving forward. So thank you so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you in a future video. Take care.